So if anybody here is not familiar with Kennedy Space Center, this is basically a color-coded map of Kennedy Space Center today. It's comprised of 140,000 acres, which is outlined in the thick black line, and is co-located with the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, which is the part in green down on the lower right. Kennedy Space Center is co-managed, jointly managed, not only by us, but also with National Park Service Canaveral National Seashore, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife's Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. And this was deliberate in a way to create a nice safety buffer from the public from any of the sort of space activities and launch activities taking place out at Kennedy Space Center. So it's a big place for a good reason. So just a very quick and brief annotated history of Kennedy Space Center. In 1947, the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station was selected as the site for a U.S. missile testing range. And its original purpose was a missile testing facility following World War II, with the first missile launching in July of 1950. Eventually, the focus shifted to launching satellites, and the space race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union began. And the first satellite launched from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station was in January of 1958. Concurrently, NASA, which was formerly known as the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, was created in October of 1958 for the peaceful exploration of space. So the co-location of Cape Canaveral Air Force Station and NASA was sort of a natural partnership because of sort of the infrastructure that existed there. And in 1958, many of the facilities at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station were transferred to NASA for its use and operation. However, when President Kennedy announced the Man to the Moon project in 1961, it was recognized that NASA's limited facilities on the Cape Canaveral side were insufficient to support the new mission. And there was new launch facilities and land were required to get the man to the moon and return him safely to Earth. So in 1962, Congress authorized the acquisition of land to create the Merritt Island Launch Area, which would eventually be renamed the John F. Kennedy Space Center in 1963. So starting in 1962, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers acted as the purchasing agent for NASA, acquired the 140,000 acres, sort of piecemeal, not all at once, but over time. And the acquired land that comprised Kennedy really actually had a lot of small towns, subdivisions, luckily many of which were undeveloped at the time, but also farms, citrus groves, and fishing camps. And eventually all of those properties got taken over pretty much by eminent domain and then razed. So Kennedy's missions started with Project Mercury, which ran from 1958 to 1963. And the goal of that was to learn if humans could survive in space. And the other goal was to put a man in Earth orbit and return him safely. From 1961 to 1966, you had Project Gemini, which used spacecraft built for 2 astronauts to develop the space travel techniques. Then from 1968 to 1972, you had Project Apollo, which succeeded in preparing and landing the first humans on the moon in July of 1969 with the Apollo 11 mission. And then from 1981 to 2011, you had the Space Shuttle program, which was NASA's human spaceflight efforts, which again resumed in, as I said, in 1981 and continued for 30 years. And the Space Shuttle was really essential for the construction of the International Space Station. So back in the 1960s, in terms of historic preservation, I want to sort of focus, it's going to be a little bit different take than Sandra. Sandra was able to do this incredible preservation project. I'm going to talk a little bit about Kennedy's adaptive reuse strategy in terms of historic preservation. So in the 1960s, the space program was popular and drew huge crowds. Man landed on the moon for the first time with an estimated 1 million people watching. The astronauts were treated like celebrities. The Kennedy Visitor Space Center or Information Center opened in 1965, and the National Historic Preservation Act was signed into law in 1966. Then in the 1970s, space tourism and the visitor centers remained very popular. The new location for the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum on the National Mall opened to the public in 1976 to help preserve the legacy of the U.S. space program. But consequently, at the same time, abandoned facilities began to decay and or become demolished. So interestingly, in the 80s, we start to see this concern that the historic preservation of the race for space is starting to disappear. And there was a public law, which was 96-344, which was approved on September 8th, 1980. And I'm just going to read it. This is the only slide I'm going to read to you. But it talks about how the Secretary shall conduct, in consultation with NASA, DoD, and any other entities considered by the Secretary to be appropriate, a study of the location and events associated with the historic theme of man in space. The purpose of such study shall be to identify the possible locations, components, and features of a new unit of the National Park System commemorative to this theme, with special emphasis to be placed on the internationally historic event of the first human contact with the surface of the moon. The study shall investigate practical methodologies to permanently safeguard from change the location structures and at least symbolic instrumentation features associated with this theme, and to display and interpret these for visitor appreciation. Governmental entities controlling these location structures and features are hereby requested to preserve them from destruction or change during the study and congressional review period insofar as is possible. So the Man in Space study focused on 26 different sites, all dated between 1915 and 1972, and documented the critical breakthroughs in overcoming barriers to spaceflight and significant events leading to the first moon landing. The goal of the study was to tell the Man in Space story through interpretation and preservation of sites and objects. It actually contemplated having the National Park Service manage many of these sites. And of interest, and what we will talk about next, relates to the last sentence in the text presented here. And I want you to focus on, the please preserve them for now. That's really what we're going to talk about. The House Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs specifically requested that the study examine alternatives for protecting the Launch Complex service structures at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station and the Apollo launch towers at Kennedy Space Center, which were both in immediate danger of being demolished. In 1981, the Park Service completed the reconnaissance survey of sites associated with the early American space program, and in 1984, the Park Service completed its NHL-themed study and identified 25 National Historic Landmarks and 1 nationally significant site listed on the National Register for Historic Places. So Launch Complex 39A is arguably one of the most famous launch pads in the world. It was built in 1963 in response to President Kennedy's challenge to Congress to land a man on the moon and to bring him back before the end of the decade. This is the challenge that led to the Apollo program and a massive expansion of NASA's operation and NASA's facilities. The first launch at 39A was Apollo 4 in 1967. Over the next 5 years, a total of 9 manned Apollo missions were launched from 39A, including Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. And the Launch Complex 39 was originally listed in the National Register of Historic Places in August of 1973. The principal structures called out in the nomination include the Vehicle Assembly Building, the Launch Control Center, a mobile service structure, 2 crawlers, the crawlerway, and launch pads A and B. Also included were 3 mobile launchers, also known as launch umbilical towers or LUTs, which I'll talk a little bit about more in detail in just a second. So as originally built in 1963, the launch pad was characterized by few fixed structures. Instead of fixed structures, you had a mobile launch platform with a launch umbilical tower or LUT attached to it. The LUT allowed access to various parts of the rocket and the spacecraft as it was mounted on it, on the mobile launch platform. The launch vehicle was then assembled on top of the mobile launch platform in the vehicle assembly building, some 3 miles away from Launch Complex 39A. And then the launch platform was then transported by a crawler along the crawlerway, and there the mobile service structure could be rolled up to allow further access for checks and inspections. The Apollo program ended in 1972, and Launch Complex 39A was decommissioned in 1974. So in 1976, Launch Pad 39A was recommissioned in preparation for the new Space Shuttle program, which was aimed to use a system of reusable spacecraft for human spaceflight. So NASA began modifications to the Launch Complex 39A to fit the shuttle, and 2 of the 3 LUTs were reused but reconfigured in order to support the new mission. The key difference between the Apollo configuration was that they added the fixed launch structures on the pad itself rather than on the mobile launch platform. The LUT was taken off of the Apollo era mobile launch platform, retrofitted and permanently affixed to the pad, and renamed the FSS, or fixed service structure. A second launch structure was built, the rotating service structure, which rotated around a vertical axis and allowed access to the shuttle payload bay. As I mentioned, 2 of the 3 LUTs were reused for this. The remaining LUT was set to be demolished and scrapped in February of 1982. Oh, sorry. So the demolition of this 3rd LUT, or the last remaining LUT, made headlines and drew attention of organized preservation groups, including NASA employees, as well as members of Congress. Lawsuits were threatened. As all of this was documented in a 714 pages of the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station National Historic Landmark nomination, which in itself reads like a historic preservation soap opera. It's very interesting. It goes quickly. A lot of it's duplicative. You should look at it. In the end, NASA compromised and agreed to disassemble the last remaining LUT, and made it available for reuse in the interpretation of space program if funding could be found. Of course, unfortunately, as many historic preservation stories go, that funding was never found. But to NASA's credit, the LUT was moved and stored in the industrial area at Kennedy until 2004, when it was eventually demolished. Now, if we go back to Public Law 96344 and the Man in Space study for just a minute, interestingly, concerns expressed by NASA, the US Air Force, the Smithsonian Institution regarding that study included the following themes: protecting sites while minimizing conflicts with agency missions, funding to support the interpretation of preservation in sites, maintaining security and safety for both the visitor and mission, allowing for reasonable modification to accommodate technological change and demolition, and of course, complying with the National Historic Preservation Act without unnecessary delays to mission and projects. Most of these themes should sound familiar to anybody working in the historic preservation field. So following in 1989, the House Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs, the Subcommittee on National Parks and Public Lands, the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation requested an analysis of preservation issues concerning federal support for the 26 sites identified in the Man in Space study. In 1991, the Advisory Council released guidance entitled Balancing Historic Preservation Needs with the Operation of Highly Technical or Scientific Facilities. NASA, of course, was featured prominently throughout the document. One of the many conclusions of that guidance was that there is room in the preservation process to allow for ongoing change and improvements to structures and equipment while they continue to function for their original purpose. So the story of Launch Complex 39A and the LUT isn't quite over yet. And it begins to paint a picture of how places like Kennedy Space Center embrace historic preservation, although not necessarily in the traditional sense of the presentation that Sandra just gave. We are still actively using most of our historic things, and so we cannot necessarily preserve them in a figurative formaldehyde jar, although we have plenty of artifacts, so to speak, that are displayed at the visitor center. But in 2011, when the shuttle and Constellation programs were canceled, Kennedy had no immediate use for the launch pads, or Launch Pad 39A, and began looking for tenants who might want to lease them. So in 2014, NASA signed a 20-year lease with SpaceX for the exclusive use of Launch Complex 39A. And this move was in keeping, although likely unintentionally, with the National Historic Preservation Act, which posits the best way to preserve a historic property is to keep it in use. So SpaceX modifications to 39A began in 2015. In 2016, they began the deconstruction of the shuttle RSS, and eventually added extra levels to the fixed service structure, which is still the original launch tower from the Apollo days. But they covered it in cladding and added a new crew access arm. The first SpaceX launch from 39A was in March of 2017, and that carried supplies to the International Space Station. And they continue to modify the launch complex to this day, understanding that technological change is inevitable and will lead to additional modifications. What have we done in the traditional sense to preserve its history and tell its ongoing story? Well, for NASA, the historic context of the National Register nomination was completed in 1973, updated in 1996 to reflect the Man in Space, Apollo, and Space Shuttle programs. In January of 2000, the complex 39A was listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and we have also done a Historic American Engineering Record, or HAIR recordation, for 39A, which was completed in August of 2010. And so we feel that this is a great example of an approach to historic preservation that embraces change as not just inevitable, but as an ongoing enhancement to the story of the place. And with every iteration of the launch pad, we like to think that its history continues and its history gets richer. And that is my presentation.